For 24 years, Elisabeth Fritzl was trapped in a dark, windowless prison, held captive, abused, and raped by her own father. While she suffered in silence beneath the family home, Josef Fritzl continued his life as a respected man in his community, hiding his monstrous crimes in plain sight. This is the story of a man who built a dungeon for his daughter, the unimaginable cruelty that took place within its walls, and the haunting questions that remain. How did he deceive his family, neighbors, and authorities for over 2 decades? How does someone lead such a horrifying double life? And how can we recognize the warning signs of evil hiding in plain sight? Josef Fritzl was an engineer, a husband, and a father of 7 with his wife, known for being strict but dependable. Beneath this ordinary facade, however, was a man obsessed with control. He orchestrated one of the most horrific crimes of modern times, one that would go undetected for nearly a quarter of a century. Born on April 9, 1935, in Amstetten, Austria, Josef grew up in a strict, emotionally abusive household. His mother, Maria Fritzl, was domineering and unyielding, showing little affection. Some experts suggest his upbringing may have shaped his obsession with control. But unlike many criminals with abusive pasts, Josef excelled academically and learned how to manipulate those around him. By the 1950s, he had become an engineer, a profession that granted him both respect in his community and the technical knowledge he would later use for sinister purposes. In 1967, he was arrested for breaking into a woman's home and sexually assaulting her at knife point. Sentenced to 18 months in prison, his record was later expunged, allowing him to continue living a seemingly normal life. His engineering skills would later enable him to construct the underground prison, where he would imprison his daughter. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case is how Fritzl managed to build a secret dungeon in his own home without raising suspicion. Under the pretense of expanding his basement, he spent years constructing a soundproof, hidden space meticulously designed for total control. He reinforced the thick concrete walls to muffle any cries for help, installed multiple layers of locked doors, and concealed the entrance behind a weighty, immovable storage shelf. This was not a haphazard prison. It was an elaborate tomb of despair, built with the precision of a man who intended to bury his secret forever. The space was suffocating, the ceiling so low that standing upright was nearly impossible. Every detail served the one purpose: to ensure she would never escape. Even when authorities searched the house following Elisabeth's disappearance, they never uncovered the dungeon's existence. Fritzl's deception was airtight, his mastery of manipulation so absolute that no one dared question what lay hidden beneath his seemingly ordinary home. The world above continued oblivious, while below, a young woman's life was being erased one agonizing day at a time. On August 28, 1984, when Elisabeth was just 18, Fritzl lured her into the basement under the guise of needing help. The moment she stepped inside, he locked the door behind her. Elisabeth's nightmare had started. For 24 years, she remained imprisoned underground, suffering unimaginable horrors, while the world above carried on as usual. To cover his crime, Fritzl reported Elisabeth as a runaway, claiming she had joined a religious cult. He even forced her to write letters confirming his story. The authorities, with no reason to doubt him, closed the case. Meanwhile, Elisabeth endured years of captivity, abuse, and forced childbirth, bearing 7 of her father's children. One of the most perplexing questions is whether Fritzl's wife, Rosemarie, truly had no idea what was happening beneath her own home. He maintained authoritarian control, ensuring no one questioned him. He explained away noises, forbade anyone from entering the basement, and manipulated everyone around him. After Fritzl's arrest, Rosemarie insisted she had no knowledge of the horrors unfolding just beneath her feet. She claimed to believe his stories and never suspected anything sinister. Experts remain divided on whether she was a victim of manipulation or engaged in willful blindness. Could she truly have been so naive, or was she too afraid to confront the truth? Some argue that her unwavering trust in Fritzl allowed his crimes to continue unchecked, while others believe she, too, was living under his psychological control, too broken to question his authority. She expressed shock and horror at the revelations, insisting she had never suspected Josef was capable of such monstrous acts. Some found her claims difficult to believe. How could she have lived in the same house for decades without realizing what was happening beneath her feet? Friends of the family also expressed shock, with some insisting that Josef Fritzl had always seemed like a strict but ordinary man, while others admitted he had an unsettling presence. Many questioned how Rosemarie could have overlooked the strange behavior, including his insistence on keeping the basement off-limits and the bizarre explanations for Elisabeth's disappearance. Yet others saw her as yet another victim, manipulated and dominated into unquestioning obedience, trapped in a life where questioning Fritzl meant severe consequences. Life in captivity was more than just isolation. It was a cycle of torment and control. Fritzl established strict routines, deciding when Elisabeth could eat, sleep, or even speak. He controlled her every movement, reducing her existence to mere survival. If she tried to resist, he would unleash his fury, beatings, starvation, or long stretches of isolation in absolute darkness. Every moment was dictated by his cruel whims, ensuring that fear became her only reality. Over time, she became entirely dependent on his whims, knowing that any defiance would be met with cruel punishment. Her resistance faded. Psychologists note that prolonged captivity breaks the mind before the body. Despite her suffering, Elisabeth resolved to survive. The conditions were horrific. The air was stale, the space cold and damp, and at times it flooded. She had no concept of time, as Fritzl controlled everything. His visits were a constant reminder that her nightmare had no end. Elisabeth gave birth to her first child in 1988, just 4 years into her captivity. The sexual abuse had begun almost immediately after she was imprisoned, with Fritzl using his complete control over her as a means to assert dominance. She endured relentless assaults, with no way to resist and no hope of escape. Her pregnancies were a direct result of this ongoing horror, and she was forced to give birth alone, in filth and isolation, without medical assistance or even basic comfort. Alone in the basement, without medical assistance, she endured excruciating labor while Fritzl stood by, offering no help beyond delivering basic supplies. Over the years, she bore 6 more children, 3 of whom were forced to live underground with her. The other 3 were taken upstairs and raised by Fritzl and Rosemarie under the pretense that Elisabeth had left them at her parents' doorstep. Authorities accepted this explanation without further investigation. The children were enrolled in school and integrated into society, unaware of their true origins, as they had been taken upstairs at a very young age. Having never known any other life, they believed Rosemarie and Josef were their biological parents, never questioning their past. Their existence helped Fritzl maintain his deception, as no one suspected that they were the product of years of abuse and captivity. The children who remained underground lived in unimaginable conditions. Deprived of fresh air, sunlight, and any semblance of a normal childhood, they grew up in complete isolation. They relied entirely on Elisabeth for comfort and education, learning to whisper to avoid detection. Their health deteriorated due to malnutrition and lack of medical care. Fritzl treated them as his property, dictating every aspect of their existence. They had no toys, no books, and no knowledge of the outside world beyond what Elisabeth could tell them. Some of them never left the basement and knew nothing beyond the damp, cramped walls of the dungeon. The fear of their father kept them silent and obedient, reinforcing the idea that escape was impossible. For nearly a quarter of a century, Fritzl maintained his horrifying secret, controlling every aspect of his captives' lives with ruthless precision. But his carefully crafted deception came crashing down when one of the children he fathered with Elisabeth fell critically ill. If you find this story as shocking as we do, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video. These real-life cases deserve awareness, and your support helps uncover more stories like this. The girl, 19-year-old Kirsten, had grown weak, slipping into unconsciousness, and Elisabeth, desperate to save her child, begged Fritzl to seek medical help. For years, she had endured his cruelty in silence, but watching her daughter slip away pushed her to the brink of desperation. This was the moment she knew she had to act, no matter the risk. On April 19, 2008, Fritzl carried Kirsten upstairs and took her to a hospital in Amstetten. Doctors were immediately alarmed by her condition. She was severely underweight, pale, and suffering from kidney failure. More disturbingly, she had no medical history, no official records, and her symptoms suggested extreme neglect. When Fritzl provided vague, inconsistent answers about her background, hospital staff became suspicious and alerted the police. Had Kirsten not fallen critically ill, how many more years would Fritzl have kept them locked away? Would they have ever been found at all? Authorities, sensing something was terribly wrong, launched an investigation. They made public appeals, urging the mother to come forward. Back in the basement, Elisabeth saw the news reports and knew this was her chance. When Fritzl returned, he realized the pressure was mounting. His carefully constructed lie was unraveling. Just days later, on April 26th, he made a critical mistake. He brought Elisabeth and her remaining children upstairs for the first time in decades, instructing her to tell the authorities that she had been living freely all these years. After nearly a quarter century of imprisonment, Elisabeth did something Fritzl never expected. She refused to lie. For the first time in 24 years, she stepped outside the basement and into the real world. The sudden brightness of the hospital lights stung her eyes. Her skin, pale from years of isolation, recoiled from the unfamiliar sensation of open air. Her heart pounded as she was led through the hospital corridors, every noise amplified, every face unfamiliar. The world she had been stolen from had moved on without her, yet she had barely aged beyond the teenager who had once descended into the basement. When authorities first questioned her, she hesitated, not because she wanted to protect Fritzl, but because fear had been ingrained in her for so long. Would he find a way to punish her? But as she looked into the concerned faces of the officers, she made a choice. She whispered 4 words that would finally shatter his web of lies. "I am Elisabeth Fritzl." The officers, stunned, could hardly process what they had just heard. It was the name of the girl who had supposedly disappeared 2 decades earlier, a name long dismissed as the tragic case of a runaway. From that moment, the nightmare began to unravel. Elisabeth, trembling but determined, told investigators everything, every horror, every moment of despair, every lie she had been forced to uphold. She spoke for herself, for her children, for the years of suffering that had been buried beneath that house. It was over. The truth unraveled quickly. Investigators pressed Fritzl for answers, and under mounting scrutiny, his web of deception collapsed. He was arrested, and during his trial, he admitted that he had been planning Elisabeth's imprisonment for years, carefully designing the basement to ensure her total dependence on him. He revealed that he always intended to keep her as his possession, a captive entirely under his control. His confessions painted a picture of a man who did not act on impulse, but meticulously orchestrated every aspect of his crime, from the basement's construction to the fabricated stories he fed authorities and family members. He even acknowledged that as he grew older, maintaining the secret became increasingly difficult, raising the question of whether his own weariness contributed to his ultimate downfall. Was his capture truly accidental, or had he grown reckless? Some criminologists argue that after decades of maintaining his web of lies, Fritzl may have wanted to be caught. His decision to seek medical help for his captive child was a rare lapse in his otherwise meticulous control. Did he believe he could still manipulate his way out of suspicion, or was the burden of his monstrous secret finally too great to bear? Did Elisabeth, growing up, ever suspect that her father was mentally ill? According to later testimonies, she had long feared him, but did not initially recognize the full extent of his depravity. He was a strict, authoritarian figure, prone to sudden bursts of anger and controlling behavior. Over time, as he imposed increasingly bizarre rules and isolated her from friends, she began to sense something was deeply wrong. Yet, like many children in abusive households, she learned to adapt rather than question, never imagining the horrors that awaited her. The case shocked the world, raising profound questions about how such evil could go undetected for so long. How many horrors remain hidden simply because we refuse to see them? This wasn't a crime committed in some remote, lawless place. It happened in a quiet, ordinary neighborhood, one just like yours. After Josef Fritzl's crimes were exposed, the family home in Amstetten, Austria, became a grim symbol of horror. The underground dungeon, where Elisabeth and her children were held captive for 24 years, was permanently sealed off by authorities to prevent anyone from ever entering it again. For years, the house remained standing, but it was abandoned. No one wanted to live there, and it became a dark reminder of the unimaginable suffering that had taken place beneath its floors. Some locals even pushed for it to be demolished, arguing that it should not remain as a macabre tourist attraction. However, due to legal and ownership complications, the house was left untouched for a long time. In 2011, the property was purchased by a company and renovations were carried out to strip it of its sinister past. The basement, however, was filled with concrete to ensure that the prison Fritzl built could never be accessed again. Reports indicate that the house was eventually repurposed into apartments, though its horrifying history makes it unlikely that it will ever be truly forgotten. Today, the Fritzl house remains one of the most infamous crime scenes in modern history. Many believe it should have been destroyed, but others see it as a chilling reminder of the evil that can exist behind closed doors. After his conviction, Josef Fritzl was sentenced to life in a high-security prison, where he was placed in solitary confinement for his own protection. Inmates despise child abusers and given the nature of his crimes, he quickly became one of the most reviled prisoners. Guards kept him under close watch to prevent attacks, but that didn't stop other inmates from harassing him whenever they had the chance. In the years following his imprisonment, reports surfaced that Fritzl had grown frail and withdrawn. Once an arrogant manipulator, he now avoided eye contact and spoke to no one. Prison officials noted that he rarely left his cell and seemed to have resigned himself to his fate. At one point, he even requested a new identity behind bars, claiming he couldn't endure the constant threats from fellow prisoners. His request was denied. Despite his isolation, he reportedly boasted that he still received fan mail, letters from disturbed individuals who saw him as a misunderstood genius. However, any sense of superiority faded as his health began to decline. By 2023, Fritzl was reportedly suffering from dementia, struggling to recognize even his own legal team. Some reports suggested he had become a shell of his former self, muttering to himself in confusion, a far cry from the calculated predator who once controlled an entire underground world. Even in prison, he remains a symbol of pure evil. Unlike Elisabeth, who rebuilt her life with quiet strength, Fritzl's final years are spent in the very isolation he once inflicted upon his daughter, locked away, alone, and forgotten. In a cruel twist of fate, the man who spent decades ensuring Elisabeth had no freedom now finds himself in a cage of his own making. But while Elisabeth emerged from her captivity with resilience and hope, Fritzl's prison is one of decay, regret, and irrelevance, a fitting end for a man who sought absolute control and lost everything instead. Shortly after his arrest, his wife, Rosemary, filed for divorce, publicly severing ties with the man she had been married to for decades. Meanwhile, Elisabeth and her 7 children began the long process of healing. They were moved to a secure location where they received intensive therapy and medical care to help them cope with the years of trauma they had endured. The transition to normal life was especially difficult for the children who had never seen the outside world. Simple experiences like walking in open spaces or hearing the sound of birds were overwhelming at first. Therapy became a crucial part of their healing, with specialists working tirelessly to help them overcome years of psychological and physical deprivation. They had to learn how to interact with others, navigate daily life, and adjust to an entirely new reality. Over time, they were given new identities to protect their privacy, and specialists worked closely with them to reintegrate them into society. Despite the horrors of their past, Elisabeth remained strong, focusing on building a new life for herself and her children, away from the shadows of her father's crimes. However, the road to recovery was fraught with challenges. Elisabeth, too, had to navigate a new world, one where she was no longer a prisoner but a survivor. Rebuilding trust in people was difficult, but she remained determined to create a stable and loving environment for her children. Over time, with the support of medical professionals and legal protections ensuring their privacy, she and her children began to adjust to their newfound freedom. Today, they live under new identities, shielded from public scrutiny, striving to build a future defined not by their past, but by their strength and resilience. Elisabeth's survival is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. If you found this story compelling, subscribe, like, and share to ensure stories like this are never forgotten.